The airport hums with life, blaring intercom announcements, hurried footsteps, the occasional burst of laughter. Families gather near their gates, business travelers tap away on laptops, and flight attendants weave through the crowd with a well-rehearsed sense of purpose. But for Vanessa Carter, the scene is layered with an unease she can't quite shake. She grips Jaden's tiny hand as he bounces excitedly, his eyes darting from the moving walkways to the endless stretch of windows revealing a fleet of waiting planes. Maya, a step ahead, chatters about how high they'll be flying. David walks beside Vanessa, his expression calm but observant. He's seen this all before. The quiet divides that no one speaks about, the way some families move through the airport with effortless ease, while others, families like theirs, must always brace for what's to come. A white couple ahead of them steps up to the check-in counter. The airline agent, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, barely glances at their IDs before handing over their boarding passes with a cheerful, "Have a wonderful flight." Vanessa steps forward next. "Good morning," she says, sliding her passport and ticket across the counter. The agent's smile flickers for half a second, barely noticeable. But Vanessa catches it. The slight hesitation before the woman picks up her ID, her eyes scanning it a little too carefully. "Headed to Montego Bay?" the agent asks as though double-checking. "That's right," Vanessa replies evenly. The woman nods, but the pause lingers. A glance between Vanessa's face and her ID, as if confirming something unspoken. Then, finally, the soft tap of keyboard keys and the mechanical whir of printing boarding passes. "Here you go, Mrs. Carter. Have a nice flight." David exhales through his nose as they step away. "Every time," he mutters. "Let it go," Vanessa says, tucking the passes into her bag. "We're not doing this today." They make their way to security, where the pattern continues. A white businessman in a suit breezes through the metal detector without a second glance. But when Vanessa steps forward, the TSA officer lingers. His gaze flickers between her passport and her face, as if waiting for something. Some justification to stop her. "Ma'am, step aside for a moment," he says. Vanessa's stomach tightens, but she forces a polite smile. "Is there a problem?" "Just a random check," he says. But the words are too familiar. She knows they aren't random. David's fingers curl into a fist, but Vanessa catches his eye. Not in front of the kids. Maya tugs on David's sleeve. "Daddy, why are they stopping Mummy?" David swallows hard. "No reason, sweetheart, just a quick check." A few tense minutes later, after a half-hearted pat-down, they're finally cleared. As they gather their bags, Vanessa exhales, forcing a smile. "See, no big deal, but inside it is a big deal. It's always a big deal, because it's never just one moment. It's all the moments stacked together year after year, flight after flight. By the time they reach their gate, the weariness has settled into her bones, but as they step onto the plane, relief washes over her. Almost there. They find their seats in first class, the reward for years of hard work. Vanessa sinks into the plush cushion, pulling Jaden onto her lap while David helps Maya settle in. For the first time that morning, she allows herself to relax. Then, a shadow falls over her. "Excuse me, Mom," a voice says. Vanessa looks up to see a blonde flight attendant standing beside her row, a polite but tight-lipped smile on her face. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" Vanessa exhales slowly, sinking into her seat. For the first time that day, her shoulders relax. The early morning stress, the extra scrutiny at security, none of it matters now. They're here, safe, ready to begin their long overdue vacation. David reaches over, giving her hand a small squeeze, a silent gesture of solidarity. Maya kicks her legs excitedly, pressing her face against the window. "How high are we going, Daddy?" 35,000 feet, David answers, smiling, almost touching the clouds. Jaden, nestled against Vanessa's side, grips his toy plane with both hands, making soft whooshing sounds as he tilts it back and forth. The moment feels right. Vanessa lets herself believe, just for a second, that maybe, just maybe, this trip will be nothing more than what it's supposed to be. A break. Then, a shadow looms over them. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice says. Vanessa looks up. A blonde flight attendant stands at the edge of their row. Her name tag reads Melissa Jansen. Her smile is practiced, polite, but something about her eyes, the way they flick between Vanessa and David, makes Vanessa's stomach clench. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" The words land like a slap. Vanessa blinks. For a moment she thinks she's misheard. Around them, other first-class passengers settle into their seats. White men in suits, an older couple flipping through a travel magazine. No one else is being questioned. David stiffens beside her. Maya turns confused. "Mommy?" Vanessa forces her voice to stay even. "Yes, we're in the right section." Melissa's smile tightens. "I just need to check your boarding passes." Vanessa swallows hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Her fingers shake slightly as she pulls the tickets from her bag and hands them over. Melissa scans them, her eyes darting between the tickets and Vanessa's face. She's looking for something, some excuse, some mistake. But there isn't one. "They're valid," Vanessa says, keeping her tone measured. Melissa hesitates. For a second, it seems like she might apologize, back off. Instead, she gives a curt nod and hands the tickets back. "Just making sure," she says, voice syrupy sweet. "We have to ensure proper seating procedures." She lingers a second too long, then turns and walks away. David exhales sharply. "Did you see her check anyone else's ticket?" Vanessa doesn't answer. She doesn't have to. Maya tugs at Vanessa's sleeve. "Mommy, why did she ask us that?" Vanessa forces a smile. "No reason, baby, just a misunderstanding." But David's jaw is tight. It's never just a misunderstanding. Across the aisle, a white businessman in 3A shifts in his seat, muttering under his breath. Vanessa doesn't catch the whole sentence, but she hears enough. "All the noise." "Noise? The kids aren't even talking." Melissa reappears, her movements brisker now, more certain. "I need you to lower your voices," she says, her tone clipped. David lets out a short, incredulous laugh. "Lower our voices? We're barely speaking." Melissa's expression hardens. "I need you to follow instructions." Vanessa feels the shift, the unspoken moment where a request turns into a warning. She's seen it before. She knows where this is going. Another flight attendant approaches. Melissa leans in, whispering something. Vanessa can't hear the words, but she sees how the other woman's eyes flick toward their family, how her posture changes. Then Melissa straightens. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane." The air is sucked from Vanessa's lungs. David bolts upright. "Excuse me?" "You're being disruptive," Melissa says smoothly. "I need you to deplane immediately." Vanessa's hands tighten around the armrests. Her body feels frozen yet burning at the same time. Around her, whispers start. She can feel eyes on them, some sympathetic, some curious, some indifferent. A few rows ahead, a man pulls out his phone. Recording. "We didn't do anything wrong," David says, his voice low, controlled, but laced with barely contained fury. Two uniformed security officers step onto the plane. Vanessa's heart pounds. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," one of them says. Maya clutches Vanessa's arm. "Mommy?" Her voice is small, trembling. "Why don't they want us here?" Jaden, still clutching his toy plane, looks up, confused but quiet. Vanessa feels something inside her crack. She could stand, she could leave, she could gather her family and walk off this plane, swallowing the injustice like she has so many times before. Or she could fight. Vanessa took a deep breath, steadying herself as she faced the flight crew. Every fiber of her being wanted to scream, but she wouldn't, not in front of her children, not in front of the people who already doubted her right to be here. Instead, she kept her voice even, her words measured. "We paid for these seats. We haven't done anything wrong." Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line, her expression unreadable but firm. "Mom, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the aircraft." A sharp, familiar sting burned in Vanessa's chest. It was the same feeling she'd had as a child when a store clerk followed her mother down the aisles, watching her hands, waiting for her to take something that was never hers. The same feeling she had when a teacher assumed she hadn't done her own work. The same feeling she had when she saw David come home after being pulled over for fitting a description. She looked around the cabin. Dozens of faces, but barely any meeting hers. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, turning their eyes to their phones, their books, their tray tables. Others whispered, but no one spoke up. No one wanted to get involved. Then, from the back of the plane, a voice cut through the silence. "This isn't right." Vanessa turned to see a woman standing near the coach section, her phone held up, recording. "Excuse me, ma'am," a flight attendant said sharply. "No, excuse you." The woman, Alicia Gomez, took a step forward. "You're kicking them off for what, sitting in the seats they paid for?" A flicker of hesitation crossed Melissa's face, but it was gone just as quickly. She turned to the airline supervisor who had arrived, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy uniform, his face already set with a decision. "Ma'am, you need to deplane immediately," he said, barely looking at Vanessa. David exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw tight. He reached for Maya's hand, his fingers trembling. "Come on, baby girl," Vanessa whispered, forcing herself to smile down at her daughter. "Let's go." Maya clung to her, her little fingers gripping Vanessa's sleeve. "But why, Mummy?" Her voice wavered. "Why don't they want us here?" Vanessa swallowed the lump in her throat. "They just made a mistake," she said softly, smoothing Maya's curls. "That's all." But it wasn't a mistake. It was never a mistake. The walk through the aisle was long, the weight of 100 stairs pressing on Vanessa's back. Jaden, blissfully unaware, held onto his toy plane, making quiet engine noises as David led him forward. Vanessa kept her head high. She refused to let them see her break. The moment they stepped into the terminal, the weight of what had just happened crashed into Vanessa like a wave. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Her hands ached from clenching them into fists. Rage burned beneath her skin, hot and consuming. "We should have fought harder," David muttered, shaking his head. Vanessa turned to him, her voice low. "And then what? Get dragged out by security? Get handcuffed in front of our kids?" David looked away, running a hand over his face. His silence was louder than any argument. Alicia caught up with them, breathless, her phone still in her hand. "I got everything," she said, her voice urgent. "I recorded the whole thing. If you want, I can post it. People need to see this." Vanessa hesitated. Her entire life she had been taught to pick her battles. She had learned to measure her words, to soften her edges, to keep herself from being seen as too much. And yet, if she stayed silent now, she knew exactly what would happen. The airline would apologize for the misunderstanding. Melissa would go back to work, and nothing would change. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone. She opened Twitter, her fingers hovering over the screen. A deep breath. Then she typed, "We were just kicked off our flight for nothing." She hit send. The fire spread faster than she expected. Alicia's video was everywhere within the hour. The footage was grainy, but the sound was clear. Vanessa's calm voice, "We paid for these seats. We haven't done anything wrong." Melissa's sharp reply, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane." Maya's trembling question, "Why don't they want us here?" The world was watching now. The comments poured in. "This is unacceptable. Stay strong, Vanessa. Disgusting behavior from the airline. Fire that flight attendant." But then there were the others. "Maybe you were being disruptive. Playing the race card again. Typical. They should have just followed the rules." Vanessa forced herself to breathe through the frustration. This wasn't new. It was just louder now. And then the airline spoke. "We regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred. We take all passenger concerns seriously." Vanessa let out a humorless laugh. A misunderstanding, not an apology, not accountability, just words carefully strung together to protect themselves. Somewhere on that flight, Melissa Jansen continued her shift, smiling at passengers, pouring drinks, moving on with her day as if nothing had happened. But Vanessa knew better. This wasn't over. Vanessa sat at the edge of the hotel bed, her phone screen glowing in the dim room. The air around her felt heavy, thick with exhaustion. The words on the screen blurred together. Messages of support, words of encouragement, but also the other kind. The kind that stuck to her skin like tar, suffocating and impossible to ignore. They probably did something to deserve it. People pull the race card way too much these days. This is why we can't have nice things. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down beside her. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest. She had thought speaking out would bring relief, some sense of justice, but instead it felt like she had invited a storm into her life. A part of her wanted to let go, to delete the post, to walk away, to tell herself that keeping her family safe was more important than proving a point. Maybe if she stopped pushing, the world would stop pushing back. Wouldn't that be easier? Wouldn't that be safer? The mattress dipped beside her. David sat down, silent for a moment before exhaling deeply. "Vanessa," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of something unspoken. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. "Do you remember that time I got pulled over on the way home from work?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was something sharp underneath it. "I did everything right. Hands on the wheel, yes officer, no officer, and still he made me step out, searched my car, treated me like a damn criminal." Vanessa closed her eyes, her fingers gripping the blanket. She remembered. She remembered how he had walked through the front door that night, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, fury vibrating through his entire body. She had never seen him look so defeated. "How many times has this happened before?" David asked. "How many times did we let it go? How many times did silence let it happen again?" Vanessa shook her head. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I have the strength." David was quiet for a long time. Then, gently, he took her hand. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he said, "but you have to decide what kind of world you want our kids to live in." Her breath hitched. Maya and Jaden. She turned her head, her eyes landing on them, curled up together on the other bed, Maya's tiny arm wrapped protectively around her little brother. Jaden's toy plane rested beside him, its wings peeking out from under his fingers. How would they remember this moment? Would they remember their parents bowing their heads, swallowing their anger, pretending nothing happened? Or would they remember their mother standing tall, even when the weight of the world tried to crush her? She thought of her own parents, the stories they told of marching in the streets, of boycotts, of sit-ins, of the times they had been afraid but fought anyway. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "If we don't fight, who will?" Vanessa wiped her face with both hands, inhaled deeply and sat up straighter. "No more," she said. David studied her, searching her face, then nodded. The momentum grew faster than she expected. Her story spread beyond social media, picked up by activists, journalists, and public figures. The video of them being removed from the plane resurfaced again and again, shared with captions like, "This has to stop." Messages flooded in, not just from strangers, but from people who had lived this same nightmare. "This happened to my father last year. My wife and I were once told we didn't belong in first class too. Thank you for speaking out. Some of us are too scared." The pressure on the airline mounted. They tried to dismiss it at first, calling it a misunderstanding, insisting that their crew was following protocol. But the more they ignored it, the louder the outrage grew. Then, Vanessa received a call that made her heart stop. "This is Attorney Marcus Ellison," the voice on the other end said. "I've seen your story, you have a case, and I want to fight it with you." Vanessa nearly dropped the phone. Marcus Ellison, a name she recognized, a name tied to some of the most important civil rights cases in the last decade. He had taken on police departments, corporations, entire systems designed to break people like her. And he had won. She gripped the phone tighter. "Do you think we can actually win?" A pause. "I think," Marcus said, his voice steady, unwavering, "you already have more power than you realize." The word sent a chill down her spine. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something other than exhaustion. Hope. The world was listening, and she was ready for the fight ahead. The airline's damage control began the way it always did, with carefully worded statements and hollow promises. "We take these allegations seriously. An internal investigation is underway. We remain committed to ensuring a safe and welcoming environment for all passengers." But the world wasn't buying it. The footage had spoken for itself. The voices of passengers had echoed louder than corporate excuses. The airline's stock took a hit, boycotts trended online, and even news anchors posed the question, how many times does this have to happen before real change is made? Melissa sat stiffly in a conference room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room smelled of stale coffee and corporate anxiety. Across from her, 3 executives and an HR representative watched as a laptop screen replayed the moment she had made her choice. standing firm, arms crossed, refusing to acknowledge Vanessa's pleas. The video had no filters, no edits, just raw truth. "We paid for these seats. We haven't done anything wrong." Her own voice played back at her, cold and dismissive. "Mom, I need you to deplane immediately." Melissa's throat was dry. The weight of her decision, so easy in the moment, now sat on her like a stone. One of the executives, middle-aged, polished, unreadable, folded his hands. "Melissa, do you have any explanation for your actions?" She licked her lips. "I was following protocol," she said carefully. "They were being disruptive." The HR representative, a woman who had barely glanced at Melissa since the meeting started, spoke without looking up from her notes. "The footage and multiple witness statements contradict that claim." Melissa's fingers curled into her lap. "I thought—" She hesitated. What had she thought? That she wouldn't be questioned? That no one would care? The executive sighed. "Given the overwhelming evidence, the company has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Her stomach dropped. "Additionally, we will be reinforcing our zero-tolerance policy regarding racial discrimination and bias through mandatory retraining across all departments." Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. This was it. She had thought she was untouchable. She had thought as she walked away from that confrontation on the plane that this would be just another day, but the world had changed overnight. And now she was the one being escorted out. Vanessa adjusted the microphone, her fingers brushing against the podium's smooth wood. The lights were blinding, but she could see the crowd. Journalists, activists, travelers, parents holding their children close. She had never planned for this moment. She was not an activist, not a public speaker. She was just a mother who had tried to take her family on a trip. But the world had made this moment necessary. She inhaled deeply. Then she spoke. "We were just trying to go on vacation," she began. Her voice was steady, but each word carried weight. "We boarded that flight like any other family, hoping to make memories. Instead, we were reminded, once again, that to some people our presence is a problem." The crowd was silent, hanging on to every word. "I have spent the last few days asking myself if I should have stayed quiet, if I should have just taken my children and moved on. But then I realized moving on is a privilege too many of us are never given. Moving on is not an option when this keeps happening." She looked down for a moment, grounding herself, before lifting her gaze again. "My parents fought for the right to sit at a lunch counter without being forced to leave. My grandparents fought for the right to vote without fear. And now, in 2025, I am still fighting for the right to sit in a seat I paid for." A murmur ran through the crowd. "This isn't just about me. This is about the countless people who have been humiliated, dismissed, and dehumanized just for existing in spaces they had every right to be in. This is about change that should have happened a long time ago." A voice from the audience, firm, clear. "We're with you." Applause rippled through the crowd. Alicia Gomez, the woman who had filmed the video that changed everything, stepped forward. "I saw what happened that day," she called out, "and I couldn't stay silent. If more of us spoke up when we saw injustice, maybe things would be different." More voices followed. "I was on that flight," someone else shouted, "and I saw the whole thing. They were treated unfairly." Vanessa exhaled slowly. This was bigger than her now. The airline's final statement arrived with a corporate coldness that could not mask its desperation. "We deeply regret the events that transpired. After a thorough review, we have terminated the employee involved and reaffirm our commitment to equity and inclusivity." But Vanessa knew this wasn't just about one employee. One termination did not erase a system of bias. One statement did not undo generations of harm. And yet, something had shifted. In the days that followed, stories poured in, Black travelers sharing their own experiences of being questioned, doubted, removed. A conversation that had long been whispered in frustration was now being spoken loudly, without apology. For years, Vanessa had taught her children about history, the struggles of those who came before, the battles fought in courtrooms and streets. She had never imagined she would be part of that fight, but now she was. And she was ready. The headlines spread across every major news outlet, each variation echoing the same message. Airline faces backlash over racial profiling incident. Mother of 2 removed from flight speaks out. A call for justice in the skies. Vanessa had never wanted to be at the center of a national conversation, yet here she was. Her name, her story, her pain dissected on news panels and social media threads. David scrolled through his phone at the kitchen table, reading through the latest wave of articles, while Vanessa sat across from him, staring at the untouched cup of tea in her hands. "It's everywhere," he murmured. CNN, MSNBC, even international outlets are covering it now. Vanessa let out a heavy breath. "I know," she said quietly. "I feel like I've told this story 100 times already." And she had. In interviews, in statements, in legal meetings. Over and over again she had relived that moment on the plane. Maya's trembling hand in hers. The cold, indifferent voice of the airline staff. The humiliation of being forced to leave like criminals. Every retelling scraped open a wound that had barely begun to heal. David reached for her hand. "If it's too much, we can step back. Let the lawyers handle the rest." She squeezed his fingers but shook her head. "If I stopped now, then what was the point of all this?" The fight had taken a toll. On her, on their family. Yet in the chaos of it all, change was beginning to take shape. The airline released a new statement, carefully crafted, designed to sound sincere. "We recognize the need for improvement. Effective immediately, all employees will undergo mandatory racial bias training. We are committed to ensuring fair treatment for all passengers." It was a small victory, but Vanessa knew policies meant little without action. Still, the pressure had forced them to move, and that was something. Her inbox was flooded. Messages from civil rights groups, lawyers offering assistance, everyday people sharing their own painful experiences of being judged before they even spoke. But not all messages were supportive. "Maybe you should have just followed the rules. Why do people always play the victim? Congrats on ruining someone's career over a misunderstanding." Vanessa closed her eyes. She had expected it, but that didn't make it easier. She thought of Melissa. How the woman had stood so firm in her conviction that Vanessa and her family didn't belong in those seats. Now, that same conviction had cost her everything. Melissa scrolled through the news articles with shaking hands, her stomach twisting at the flood of hate in her inbox. Racist flight attendant gets what she deserves. Maybe if she learned some empathy, she wouldn't be jobless right now. She slammed her laptop shut, her breath coming fast. "This isn't fair," she muttered. "This is cancel culture." Her phone buzzed. A call from an unknown number. She let it ring out, but the voicemail notification popped up. "Melissa, it's Julie from HR. I just wanted to say, I hope you're doing okay. Things got out of hand fast, and I know this must be difficult, but maybe it's time to reflect. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Melissa deleted the message. She didn't need pity. She needed someone to see that she wasn't the villain here. She had only done her job. Through the noise, one truth remained unshaken. Vanessa's family had each other. As they sat together on the couch, Maya curled up beside her mother, Jaden resting his head on David's shoulder. The weight of the world felt a little lighter. Maya looked up, her voice small. "Mummy, are we going to be okay?" Vanessa stroked her daughter's hair. "Yes, baby. We're going to be okay." Because no matter what the world said, they had stood up. They had spoken their truth, and that was something no one could take away. Vanessa had always believed that if you played by the rules, if you worked hard, if you treated others with kindness, the world would do the same for you. But life had shown her otherwise. She was no longer the woman who sat frozen in shock as a flight attendant dismissed her dignity. No longer the woman who wondered if it was safer to let things go. She had walked through the fire of public scrutiny, of self-doubt, of exhaustion so deep it had nearly consumed her. And yet, here she stood, unbroken, unafraid, unwilling to be silent ever again. Her voice had become more than a headline. It had become a force for change. The partnership with advocacy groups had happened naturally, a response to the overwhelming number of messages from people who had endured the same humiliation, the same profiling, the same injustice. Vanessa met with travelers, attorneys, activists, people who had been fighting this fight long before her own experience brought it into the spotlight. "It's not just about my family," she told them in meetings, her voice steady. "It's about every black mother who's held her child's hand and had to explain why the world doesn't always see them as innocent. It's about every person who's been told they don't belong in a space they rightfully earned." She spoke at panels, she attended rallies, she pushed for policy changes that extended beyond performative apologies. The work was tiring, but it was necessary, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she was doing exactly what she was meant to do. David watched her with admiration, his heart swelling with pride every time she stood in front of a room full of people and spoke her truth. In his university lectures, he wove her experience into his discussions on systemic racism, using it as a living example of the power of resistance. "Racism isn't always loud," he told his students. "It's often a quiet, insidious thing. A denial of service, an assumption of guilt, a refusal to see our humanity. But history shows us that change comes when people like Vanessa refuse to accept that silence is the price of survival." And their children? They were learning too. Maya and Jaden were still young, but they understood now, in their own way, what it meant to stand up for something. Maya no longer shrank when she heard people whisper about their family on the news. Jaden, once confused about why his mother had cried that night, now beamed with pride when he saw her on TV. At bedtime one evening, as Vanessa tucked them in, Maya looked up with wide, curious eyes. "Mummy, does this mean you're famous?" Vanessa chuckled softly, brushing her daughter's curls away from her face. "Not famous, baby. Just making sure people listen." Maya thought for a moment. "Is that what being brave means?" Vanessa felt a lump rise in her throat. "Sometimes, yes," she whispered. "Being brave means telling the truth, even when it's hard." Maya nodded as if she understood, then nestled into her pillow. Vanessa kissed her forehead, knowing that no matter what the world said, her children would never doubt the power of their voices. The flight felt different this time. Vanessa sat beside David, with Maya and Jaden tucked between them. The hum of the plane, the quiet chatter of passengers, the distant voices of flight attendants making their rounds. It should have felt routine, but for Vanessa it was something else entirely, a test, a reclaiming of space. Maya shifted in her seat, glancing around before turning to her mother. Her voice was soft but carried the weight of all she had seen, all she had come to understand. "Mommy, will they let us stay this time?" The question sliced through Vanessa's heart, not because it was unexpected, but because it was necessary. She reached for her daughter's hand, gripping it with gentle strength. She met Maya's eyes, letting her see the certainty there. "They'll have no choice," she said, and as the plane ascended into the sky, Vanessa breathed deeply, carrying the weight of the past, but standing taller than ever before. She had spoken, she had fought, and she had won.